Welcome to the Center for Languages and Intercultural Communication at Rice University. In this workshop, Glenn Martinez will illustrate the issue of introducing language variation into the second language classroom. While he will use Spanish as his driving example in the workshop, the idea of introducing language variation in the classroom has been tied to the development of research on and teaching for heritage language learners. Let's listen to what Glenn has to say about this.
Really, the issue of standard Spanish or prestige Spanish or this standard languages has been a foundational tension in Spanish for heritage learner education. The role of standard language and the implications of a standard language for other non-standard varieties was something that goes back all the way to Guadalupe Valdez's initial calls for heritage language instruction. Her first observations about the need for heritage language instruction emerged from her observation of what was happening to Latino students who were entering for the first time in a university like New Mexico State, where she was at the time, and she would see that they would finally get into the doors of the university are finally open to them. They get into college, and they go to the Spanish department. That's the department that's most like home. They get there, and the Spanish professors say, "Well, whoa! Your Spanish is not the Spanish that we speak here. I think you should go back to Spanish 101 and relearn it from the beginning. Forget everything you know, relearn it as a second language learner, and then you can make your way into the academic circles of Spanish." And she was really reacting to this attitude and saying, well, wait, these students bring assets, these students bring knowledge, these students bring competencies that are different and that are in fact superior to the mainstream student population, and therefore we should find ways to incorporate them, right, and to serve their needs. And that really is the beginning of this idea of having different tracks, right, one for heritage learners, one for second language learners. However, even though this tension was one of Valdez's initial concerns in proposing a different track, she didn't abandon the idea of a prestige variety. In fact, when she proposed the goals of heritage language learning some 20 years later, one of those goals was the acquisition of a prestige variety, right? So one thing that we should do as heritage learners is provide access to these different varieties of language that will open doors, presumably for students in different areas, right? So the issue is one that has been foundational in heritage language education, and the question of which language or which variety to teach is one that has sparked considerable debate after Guadalupe Valdez. And then you have someone like Daniel Villa, and you have one of his articles in your packet. And basically what he says is, tell me why U.S. Spanish, tell me why the Spanish that these students speak in their homes and in their communities, why is that not adequate for instruction, right? And that's kind of the elephant in the room that no one ever really addressed.
Our understanding of the issue of language variation is related to many non-linguistic factors such as cultural, social, and political norms. Glenn introduces these issues in terms of both the way we define language and the way we understand the position of language in society.
As our understanding of language and power, as our understanding of linguistic ideology, and as our understanding of language itself is being challenged and reformed, we're finding that the old debates about standard versus non-standard may need some revision. Descriptivist creed, right? So descriptive linguistics is this area of linguistics that emerged in the early 20th century, designed to describe languages as they are used, not as people would like them to be used. So you have this this distinction or polarity between descriptivism and prescriptivism, right? So language activity can be prescriptive, saying this is the way you must speak, or it can be descriptive, saying this is the way people speak. What we find is this creed that all languages are equally rich and complex, that all languages and all varieties serve perfectly the needs of their speakers to convey the values, ideals, and expressions that they have. And this seems to really be the underlying belief that is sparking this debate about standard and non-standard languages in the teaching of Spanish. Every language is as good as any other language, right? No language is any better or any worse.
According to descriptivists, all languages are equal. Take a moment to consider the following questions. What does it mean that all languages are equal and that all varieties serve the needs of their speakers? Think about your experience as a student. Were you taught your language or another language with a descriptivist or a prescriptivist approach? Think about your experience as a teacher. Which approach do you use? Why? Glenn says that when we say, we just need to show our students which variety is appropriate and when, we are implicitly placing a value judgment on each variety. What do you think about that? How can we avoid such value judgments?
There are options that say, well, all we need to do is show students that one's appropriate and one's not. Well, when you say one variety is not appropriate, then you are implicitly putting a value judgment on everywhere that student has used that form, right? So IGA is inappropriate. Well,
Glenn states that the sources of inequality for different varieties of languages are not linguistic, but rather extra-linguistic. These sources are rooted in our social, political, and cultural norms.
Who establishes the norms and rules, and are those norms and rules contestable and negotiable?
What do you think?
Can you contest prestige language? We know that these standard forms are in fact negotiable and they're contestable, and right, and they're open to challenges.
Glenn introduces a practice-based perspective of language using Pennycook's definition.
This brings me to the idea of practice-based view of language, ideology, and power. And I don't take the notion of practice lightly or use it as a mere appendage. You know, generally we'll talk about literacy practice or language practice, and it's simply, you know, something we're putting at the end, when really what we're thinking about is language in its age-old conceptualization. But when we talk about language practice, I think we are really shifting what we mean by language. So I view practice as a crucial framework for viewing language within its social context. Languaging, right, as a verb, as something that's done, as something that's acted out consistently, not the same all the time, depending on the context in which it's being acted out, and an activity that is rooted in agency, right? In the agency of the speaker.
What does this shift in focus from system to social practice mean? Let's consider Glenn's question about this. Now, let's say that we adopt the prescriptive view of language as a standard system that is isolated from the context of its use. What are the consequences of this perspective? Well, first of all, students might abandon Spanish because of the negative views of non-standard varieties of the language. If you constantly tell students that their Spanish isn't enough or isn't proper, they won't want to speak Spanish. Second, students often say that they want to be corrected. At that point, the question is, what does that desire tell us about standard and non-standard language practices? Take a few moments to consider the following questions. How can our approach to correction as educators be more nuanced? How can we consider the value of different language varieties without speaking negatively about them?
Let's look at some of those options for teaching a Spanish variety.
As Glenn has shown, our understanding of the issue of language variation affects teaching and learning of languages in the classroom. In fact, specific approaches to language teaching and learning might reflect a specific position concerning language variation.
Let's look at some of those options for teaching a Spanish variety. Traditional approaches are generally not even cognizant of the debate, right? They simply take their approach and, normally without even considering what implications and what theoretical grounding kind of informs those approaches. Contemporary approaches recognize the debate and take a particular stance, right? Either in terms of how and whether to teach a standard variety. This is, of course, the most traditional approach. It focuses on teaching students features of standard Spanish while at the same time eliminating or eradicating non-prestige forms present in the student linguistic varieties. The characteristic are the list se dice, no se dice, right? So in older Spanish for Heritage Learners textbooks, you'll find these lists at the end of each chapter. Se dice haya, no se dice haya. Se dice camioneta, no se dice troca, right? And so forth, okay? They use words such as barbarismos, right? Or contaminación. Negative views of non-standard languages abound generally in eradication approaches. And this is an example from a syllabus that was examined in Sarah's article. So improve learners' ability to read, listen, write, and read in Spanish. Identify the English forms that intrude in the Spanish that is spoken in the United States and find ways to avoid them, right? So these are not syllabi from the 50s, right? This is like this is present day, right? So it still exists and it's alive and well. Another view is the expansion view. So this is a focus on developing learners' competence in Spanish by focusing exclusively on standard or academic forms of the language. And although there's no explicit mention of substitutions, learners' varieties are not acknowledged, nor do they appear to be valued, right, within the instruction. So it's sort of the same kind of subordination you see in eradication, but it's subordination by omission, not subordination by identifying it explicitly, right? So simply ignore it, it doesn't exist. Right, and there's nothing else, right? So that's kind of the approach. And here's an example of a course objective: distinguish and apply formal registers of Spanish in oral and written discourse with an appropriate level of proficiency, right? So only formal, right? And there's nothing else, right? So this is what we do in the class. There's not room for anything else. So those are two traditional approaches. Contemporary approaches include appreciation. So an appreciation approach is more of an additive approach that values language diversity and seeks to add the standard to the learner's linguistic repertoire. There is an emphasis on making students aware of dialectal differences in the Spanish language. So non-standard dialects are acknowledged, right, in the syllabus. They're normally not valued, and they're certainly not practiced or instructed, right? So, there is no activity, no teaching that encourages the utilization of non-standard forms, right? But there is some acknowledgement of their existence. So a course objective example: students will be introduced to the main linguistic varieties and cultural patterns of the Spanish-speaking world, with a special emphasis on the Spanish varieties and cultures in the U.S., right? So that's kind of recognizing and acknowledging these distinctions of varieties without necessarily instructing or utilizing them. The appropriateness-based approach is an additive approach that seeks to add the standard language to the learner's linguistic repertoire and explicitly teach learners about the appropriate context for use of each linguistic variety or register so that they can modify their language use based on each specific situation, right? So in this approach, we recognize the different varieties and we try to sort those out or distribute them based on context, right? So Kim Potosky has the now famous metaphor that she utilizes to describe this. It's called the beach and wedding metaphor, right? So it's perfectly appropriate to go to the beach with sandals and shorts and a t-shirt, but not to a wedding, right? And the same thing with language, right? Some language forms are appropriate for some contexts, other language forms are appropriate to other contexts. So standard and non-standard forms are both acknowledged and practiced. There is an emphasis on knowledge of context, and contexts are generally predefined and externally determined based on social norms, including, I would argue, the preferences and prejudices of the instructors. Who defines the beach and the wedding, right? I mean, you know, there are certain dangers in this kind of approach, because you are assuming, as an instructor, you're assuming the authority to determine the context, right? This idea is probably the most common in terms of options for teaching. It's also been severely criticized. So in Norman Fairclough's book, not Language and Power, Critical Discourse Analysis, he has a whole section on appropriacy and appropriateness, right? And what are the pitfalls when we start talking about appropriateness? One of them is what I just mentioned, that really we're the ones who are defining what's appropriate and what's not, right? We're defining the context. And then the critical approach is a focus on making students' varieties central to heritage language instruction and making students aware of the social and political functions of languages, specifically of Spanish in the U.S., in addition to teaching standard forms. So, you know, there are many varieties and manifestations of the critical approach, but all have in common a focus on social and political functions. There are different ways of implementing this focus, right? Some people focus on awareness versus knowledge, right? So trying to make students aware of these political differences, or trying to make them knowledgeable about the political basis for language difference, or you know, going from knowledge to practice, right? So how do students actively contest these standard language ideologies? So the critical approach, I think, is more eclectic. It takes various forms. So you have Daniel Villa's article, my article, and Jenny Lehman's article in your materials, and you can kind of see there the subtle differences between each of them and what they tend to emphasize. We find issues like affective issues, issues in terms of, you know, talking about social change and social transformation as kind of Lehman's angle on it. So that's the critical approach. Now, how do you think these different approaches are represented in the heritage language curriculum today?
Glenn asks, if we did a survey of 150 syllabi, how many instances of each approach do you think we would find? Take a moment to consider which you think is the most represented or least represented in syllabi.
This is the kind of the bell curve. Most of them are actually expansion in Sarah's study. There's more eradication than there is critical, right? Which is surprising, but still more eradication. I think a lot of it is based on textbooks. I think it's controlled by the textbook industry, and our textbooks are not open to incorporating critical perspectives at all, right? So anyone who adopts a critical perspective generally does so at their own expense and beyond the textbook, right? So textbooks, certainly, they want to maintain that middle ground, make sure that their textbook is a product that can be sold to as many people as possible. So let's go quickly through the curriculum design. What I wanted to do now was really to kind of explore the way that these newer approaches, community-based learning, community service learning, and language for specific purposes, can really help us to open up, you know, the discussion and the teaching of language varieties. Community-based learning would be developing ethnographic sensibility, bringing the community into the classroom, valuing the community, right, and things that we tend to do today that certainly weren't done back in the 1950s, right? with the eradication approaches. Community service learning, so you guys have the internship course, and that's certainly linked to that. Other activities that are done within the classroom. And finally, language for specific purposes is another area where students are really having the opportunity to develop language use within a specific domain, dealing with a specific set of vocabulary and discourses, right? So how can these different approaches help us to improve the way that we teach language variation? Their fundamental goal was to communicate with the patient, not to say it correctly or incorrectly, right? It was communication, right? So I think that that's one of the ways in which integrating language instruction with the community can really help us to generate the awareness and the knowledge and the understanding of language variation, in the classroom.
Glenn gives an example of a way that these newer approaches can improve the teaching of variation. He looked at a Spanish for Healthcare internship experience in which heritage speakers worked in the community with speakers of non-standard Spanish. The students' goal, in the end, was communication, not correctness. Consider the examples shown here of how the students considered their goals in this internship experience. What is guiding their work? What do they need to determine about the language in order to communicate? How can this type of activity or experience encourage students to be aware of language variation? Are you ready to try this out for yourself? Use the activity given under this video to think about your own courses and how you can incorporate new approaches to teaching language variation. So, what have we learned in this workshop? Well, first of all, we have learned that a language may have a standard and more prestigious variety and other non-standard varieties. Each variety is equally rich and fit to serve the community needs of the people who speak it. This perspective comes from a descriptive approach to the study of language. The descriptive approach studies how languages are used and the context of their use, and not how grammarians think that they should be used. In line with this approach, it is important to bring language variation into the classroom. This can be done through contemporary approaches to language teaching that increasingly sensitize students to the variation of language forms depending on the context of their use. These can be applied in any language classroom, not only in heritage language courses. Every time we use a language, we have to make language choices that are tailored as much as possible to the context. We are best equipped to do this if we have a wide pool of resources to choose from. The more varieties we know, the more language forms we know, and the more fitting and effective our contributions will be. Thank you for watching.